Hello, this is Michael Reed Dimmock, and you're listening to Flipping the Table, a podcast featuring honest conversations and brief commentaries about the future of food and farming. I'm inspired by the thousands of farmers, ranchers, entrepreneurs, activists, and policymakers across this nation who are meeting the many challenges related to nutrition, poverty, pollution, and climate. This podcast highlights the people and actions making our planet and communities healthier and more resilient. I hope to inspire listeners to use their food purchases and their votes, our democracy, to flip the table in support of a new and better food system for us all, to be part of the delicious revolution now underway. Today, my guest is Miakoda, a lifelong bridge builder across what they call the dismembered sectors of society. We will discuss the opportunity to create more food movement power through the dedication of its members to have difficult but healing conversations related to racism, sexism, ageism, and gaps in levels of privilege. Miakoda is the founder of Fierce Allies, which is dedicated to supporting individuals and organizations to cross the boundaries of race and privilege through dialogue and ritual that allow truth-telling and intimacy to emerge. Miakoda is a two-spirited woman who uses the gender pronoun we, us, ours, or they, their, them. They have over 2 decades of experience as an executive and consultant, facilitating leadership development, sustainable organizational change, diversity, equity, inclusion, and conflict resolution. They have done extensive work teaching emotional and social intelligence to incarcerated populations. As Miakoda describes it, their ancestors are both indigenous and immigrants to this continent. They are a settler, resettled as a result of choice, slavery, and the Trail of Tears. They were born and raised on Lenape territory, known in dominant culture as Brooklyn, New York. They currently reside on Chochenyo Ohlone land, co-opted and renamed as Berkeley, California. During more than 2 years of group work and coaching, I came to know and respect Miakoda's power to build trust, a willingness from individuals to become vulnerable within groups of great diversity in gender, race, age, and privilege. In short, the spaces they create are healing and inspiring, and I believe an antidote to much of what ails our nation. Welcome, Miakoda. And thank you for driving up from Berkeley on this rainy Sunday afternoon. And just so the audience knows, we're sitting in a living room of my home where we have a nice fire going and drinking tea. So if you hear the crackling, you'll know what it is. So before we begin, let's just set some context. Could you share with us the purpose of Fierce Allies?
Sure. First, I want to thank you, Michael, for having me here on the podcast. And let's see, Fierce Allies. The purpose of our work is to create communities of people that are practicing Fierce Allies practices. And those practices, there's a couple of components that make it what it is. And one is they're leaders that do what I refer to as facilitative leadership, which is distinct in the sense of they're not leaders that are followed. They're leaders that actually facilitate the leadership of everybody in the room. So the work is very much based in popular education pedagogy. The people know. So these are leaders that are really good at catalyzing the leadership of everybody in the room. Mm. The other things that I think really make the sort of community of practice unique is these are people that are resource to have emotionally charged conversation to talk about the things we know we need to be talking about if we're really going to foster change.
So honest conversations.
Honest conversations. And really the conversations that we often avoid because they're high risk. Mm-hmm. How do we navigate that risk responsibly, but recognize that we have to have those conversations if we want to alter the status quo? Mm-hmm. And then I would say the third piece that's really distinguishing is, you know, we often say, what if we created communities and cultures where nobody gets thrown away? So that's, you know, that can be, we don't put people in prisons, right? That's not an acceptable option. And similarly, we also don't get to say, I won't work with that person. I don't like that person. That if the person's here and they want to be part of the solution, we have to figure out how to create an ecosystem where everybody's needs get met, but we're also using a strong analysis of equity and justice that allows those needs to get met in a way where everybody thrives.
Wow. Okay. Well, this is very important. I mean, the reason I thought it would be good for us to talk today is because the types of conversations that people usually try to avoid are the conversations that I believe will empower the food movement if we have them. It will allow people to work together better. And so, could you talk about some of the outcomes as you're successful, as you do more and more of this? What types of things would you like to see happen within the food movement or food sovereignty movement or the world?
Well, I mean, I think there's two pieces to what I feel like you're asking. There's what I want to see in the organizations and movements that I'm working with, and then what specifically is needed for the food movement. And I'll be honest, I don't really feel like I'm the one who has the answers about what's needed in the food movement. I'm a facilitative leader. So my job is to facilitate the dialogues so that the leaders within that movement are actually talking about that. And it's actually really important for me to not get in the agenda. I certainly have thoughts because of the privilege of having interacted with so many leaders in the movements. There's certainly some themes around that. And I would say the most important one that comes to mind is making sure those that are on the front lines, those that are most affected by climate change, inequity, injustice, that they are given the resources, the authority, and the power to solve their own problems. They know what they need. The challenge they have is they don't have the resources, and they often don't have the relationships that allow them to really innovate and try things that are out of the box, which keeps the wisdom that comes from experience from really maximizing. So that's the common theme I hear in all the dialogues that I facilitate, is the importance of shifting resources in that direction so those leaders can create their change. And I think there's a restorative justice element to that as well. Should I say a little bit about that?
Please.
Yeah, so restorative justice is an important component of this work, as you know, Michael. And one of the things that I love most about restorative justice is the idea that those that are impacted are part of the solution. So it's distinct from retributive justice, which is what we have out in the world, which is somebody breaks a law, they commit a crime, they cause harm. The state goes, it's between them and the state when you're in a court of law, and the person who is impacted gets nothing, is not consulted, is not part of the solution. So their wounds stay their wounds. And then if you know anything about trauma healing, you know that hurt people are the ones that hurt people. So if you don't attend to the hurts of those people and the way they've been harmed, chances are they're going to become perpetrators of similar harms. And so one of the ways that you address that is giving the people who did not have the power to protect themselves, give them that power back, and then ask them, what would you do with it? And allow them to literally, experientially reclaim that power to protect what they love. And so that feels like an important aspect of the food movement and the Fierce Allies work at large.
Because what you're saying, it seems to me, is that in order to fix the food system, that is to make healthy food accessible, to allow people to have more agency over what they choose to eat or have access to eat, we need to give them a place within that movement to make decisions or to impact policy or to grow their own food even.
Certainly that, and I think it's really important that we not step over the reparations aspect of the implications of the injustice in our food system. There are so many people that are systemically challenged, under-resourced, underfed. The combination, the complications of all of that, the way they compound in every aspect of people on the front lines, people of color, low-income people, how that affects their lives, every aspect of their life, without that being acknowledged, spoken to, and thought going into how do we address that, it just feels really superficial. And I don't know. I think it's one of the reasons that when we have conversations around shifting dynamics of power, that people with power are so afraid to distribute power to others, because they're afraid, well, if they get power, they might screw us too. And they probably will, if we don't bring a restorative, healing component to the process.
So it's not about just getting even, because if you don't do the restorative piece, it can be about getting even.
Yeah, yeah. And not just getting even, but I think it really comes from, I don't trust you. So I don't trust you, so I got to look out for me. So it keeps us in that dichotomous me versus you, us versus them sort of paradigm.
Win-lose.
Win-lose, exactly. And if we really want to change what we're doing, we have to interrupt that patterning of us versus them and move into a we paradigm, that it's us plus them.
So Miakoda, you've given us some good context and an understanding of the approach you've taken, some of the influences, but I want to go deeper into that before we go back into the food sovereignty movement and the food movement and work around that. I would like to hear more about your personal journey, that is your evolution in thinking and experience that led you to your purpose now.
I mean, it's a big question. It's funny. At some point, my dad decided that he wanted to better understand the work that I'm doing. So he went on my website, started reading about it, started taking notes, and then he sat me down and like grilled me with these questions. And slowly, as he was, so this is how this works, and people pay you to do that, and had all these great questions. And then eventually, he's like, "Oh, you've been doing this since you were 5," and it really does feel like, as somebody who grew up in an interracial family, that had, not my nuclear family, obviously we had a similar class status, but there's quite a range of access to financial resources across the diversity of that family. There was a lot of tension, and members of my family were disowned by other members of my family, and that never made sense to me. And I always thought that I had a role to play in helping them love each other. So since I was 5, I've been, trying to broker those kinds of conversations with, a little bit of success, but mostly just, learning a lot about humans, and trying to not lose sight of how love was always at play. My mother was disowned by my father for marrying my dad. So my mom's white, my dad's black. And I'm pretty clear that my grandfather disowned my mom for marrying my dad because my grandfather loved my mom so much and was afraid that if she got involved in an interracial relationship and had interracial kids, this is the late 60s, early 70s, that would be dangerous for her. And he loved her so much that he dug his heels in, and he didn't have skillful means by which to protect what he loved. So he enacted unskillful means. And so that was probably the first recognition that I had of, people are always acting on behalf of love. And a lot of times it's unskillful. And I believe a lot of the times it is unskillful because we don't get to practice having these really important conversations.
That's a huge thing you just said. What you said is that most all the time people act from love. I believe that. I think it's often hard for us to see that in the world or to believe that, particularly in a time like now when there's so much conflict. We want to project darkness on people. That is, their motivation is not right. But so I want you to say, in a way, I really want people to hear this, that your belief is that, given the context in which you grew up, you still were able to see that people's motivation was really love and protecting what they loved.
I mean, I think I always knew that, but where I actually concretely learned that was when I started working in prisons. And I remember when I was working in the Alameda Juvenile Detention Center, And consistently we were asking, we're facilitating dialogues between the kids, like, what got you here? Why did you act the way that you act? And if you actually take the time to ask incarcerated populations, why did you do what you do? And you ask it really from a place of like, I respect you and I trust that there was a good motivation in there. So it's not a test question, but like really what was going on? They steal so they could buy their mom a gift. They acted violently because they were afraid or someone they love was in danger. It's always some sort of act of love. And especially with the incarcerated youth, they were young with limited resources and limited opportunities to protect what they love. So they did the best that they could. And often, am I allowed to curse on this podcast?
Yeah.
Yeah. So the quote that I think I'm most famous for is, often our best is pretty shitty. And one of the things I like to invite people is to recognize, if you can remember that people are always doing the best they can, but often their best is pretty shitty. If you can make peace with that, your relationships get much better. And in a lot of ways, that's at the heart of what this work is. Like, we're all doing a pretty shitty best. But what if we practice it? We could actually make that best get better, but we need to be able to practice. We need to be able to make mistakes. We need to be able to both get and integrate the feedback of how that best didn't produce the result that I wanted. And then we need to try again. So that's basically what we're doing in the Fierce Allies work.
Very interesting. So, just to recap, what I heard is that you grew up in a certain context where there were boundaries of race and privilege that you were moved out of love to cross and to help people cross them. And through that process, you learned that generally people's motivations are good, but they may not have the skills or the knowledge to effectively cross boundaries or protect or show love. And somehow that led you to work in the prisons or with incarcerated youth and later in the prisons. And that brought you to this idea of creating Fierce Allies.
Yeah, I mean, I think I was doing Fierce Allies before it was a creation, so to speak, long before I even went into the prisons. I used to do fundraising consulting. Well, actually, I was doing organizational change strategy consulting, and I was really good at it. And what often happened is the organizations would exponentially increase their fundraising, so people thought I was a fundraising consultant. But the reason I was so effective was because I was helping people build trust across the gap of wealth. Mm-hmm. And so helping those that were my clients, so those weren't, nonprofit organizations, generally working on behalf of, low income, marginalized populations, to embody the dignity that like, oh, we actually have what they want. I know it seems like we want what they have, which is money, but they want to help. And they want to make a difference, and they want to make, a meaningful difference. And so if your work has credibility, stand in your dignity of you have what they want, and then give them an opportunity to participate. And so how do you change the way that you approach fundraising in that way? And when we would do that, we would often, talk straight to the funders about, so if you really want to help us, here's how you got to help us. And it's not us fitting into your overly red taped, process with lots of documents and documentation. And we would often start by doing that because we actually know that you seem to think that this is what's important. So we care about your needs. But now that we've done that, we want to really invite you to meet us and help us meet our needs so that we can meet our clients' needs. And so what I realized was what I was doing was helping to develop those relationships. And the funders actually loved it because nobody told them what to do or how to do it better, right? They were just doing the best they knew how, and everybody else was afraid to speak truth to power to them. Mm-hmm. And so they were letting them be ineffective, right? Be doing a shitty best. And so how do you, again, create those relationships where you're looking at the dynamics of power differently? So I think that's another important piece to think about is, I often say that if in this work, people often think that power is a limited commodity. So in order for me to do what I need to do, I need your power. Power's not that way. Power is generative. So there's no limitation on the forms that it comes in or the quantity of it that's available. So how do we start looking at the different forms of power that are not necessarily valued in our society, but we actually know are important, essential, and impactful?
Give me an example of that. I think it would be interesting for us to see an example, hear an example of that. Describe it.
Resiliency. Frontline folks, and I mean, God, I would say resiliency and compassion, actually. So people who have been the victims of systemic oppression actually know what it feels like to be hurt and harmed by abuses of power. So it's an interesting, this is a little bit complicated in the sense that I think because we only have examples, or we mostly have examples in society of people who abuse power, a lot of people on the front lines don't actually want power, and power in the conventional definition of it, right? Like money or authority, because they're afraid they will also abuse power, because mostly that's what we see. So it's like easier to just kind of put your hands up and point, finger wag, and say you're not doing it well. But what I believe is that those who have been systemically oppressed actually know the hurt, the harm, the implications of that abuses of power, and therefore need to leverage that as power and trust that when I get power and privilege, I will not make those same mistakes. And there's a power in knowing what it is to be oppressed.
Mm-hmm.
No, I'm not necessarily wishing that everybody experiencing, but I do believe that, again, having a hard life and not having things given to you easily creates resiliency, creates appreciation. And those are the kinds of values that we need to be factoring into our systems of power.
Well, I can kind of add to that picture because I've had experiences with colleagues women of color particularly, who we've worked with and who have been so patient about us either raising money that will pay them or paying them, actually getting the money to them. And I remember having a conversation with one colleague in particular who said to me, "Don't worry, I'm used to this, and I can wait. I'm patient." And in conversations following with her and following later times, she would say, "Oh yeah, we can work through this. I'm used to this. I mean, she's tough. Basically, she's tough, and she's not afraid, and she's willing to suffer in a certain sense because she believes in what she's doing." And so there is power in that. A couple of things. One is my respect for her was hugely enhanced, and she's kind of a go-to person for me now because I realized, man, she's deeply committed to this.
And I think it's, it's the opposite of fragility, right? Like white fragility, privileged fragility. Like, this is not so bad. We have some perspective on this. And again, there's a real importance for us to be lifting those powers up and getting those embedded in the systems of power that we're perpetuating and building. And right now, most of those that hold power come from a very fragile, environment. We're like, oh, that's hard. Oh, that's uncomfortable. Oh, and then they have to, grab on and I don't even know what words to use. I guess it's have control, which undermines innovation, undermines creativity, undermines collaboration, and so.
And it keeps people unmotivated if they don't have the power because they're like, wow, why should I risk? Why should I put the energy in if I'm really not going to have influence? I'm just a cog. I see that a lot. So this is a good place for us to move the conversation a bit. I want to move more into your relationship to the food sovereignty movement, where this is really how we came into contact. And so I'd like you to talk a little bit about, how would you describe food sovereignty? First of all, let's start with a definition. But and it doesn't have to be precise, but just what's the frame that you use or hold in your head as you work with the folks from that world, and the relationship of the food sovereignty movement to these dynamics we've just been discussing. Why is it important for us to deal with crossing the boundaries of race and privilege and unleashing the power and energy that we're discussing. Why is that so important?
There's a lot in there.
I know it's a lot in there.
So
We'll
if
break
I
it down.
missed
We'll
you,
break
you
it down
break
slowly.
Okay.
Okay.
Great. So food sovereignty, I'm not a big fan of offering definitions, but for me, what it means is I really link the word sovereignty with autonomy. And so food sovereignty is linked to land. But being able to determine and dictate your own, being responsible for, accountable for, and I guess responsible in the sense of not being on the receiving end of food, but like, this is mine. I'm going to build it. I'm going to create it. I'm responsible for how the choices involved with getting it to me, what's available to me, how much of it, how it moves, all of that kind of stuff to me. So it feels bigger than food justice, it's almost the difference between equality and equity. Mm-hmm. Like, oh, we're not trying to make sure people have equal access to food, mm-hmm. And equitable is more nuanced in the sense of you've got to be thinking about the system at large and how that's at play. And with food sovereignty, it's similar. It's not just about making sure everybody has access to nutrition, but that they have. I mean, food is life. It's everything. Every day we should eat 3 meals a day. And if you don't have control and say over what that looks like, you are
a victim
of the system.
Yeah.
You are a victim of the system.
So what you're talking about, I mean, people use the word agency, but I think of it as power. It's the ability to make a decision that has an outcome that you're seeking influence. So food sovereignty, it really, just to add a little color for folks, it emerged really out of peasant movements in the developing world, Latin America particularly, but also now all around the world. And Food First, an organization in Berkeley, has been a big part of that movement. Oakland, actually, they're from Oakland. But it's an important term, and many people, I've talked to funders who really think of it as a developing world issue, but I've been saying, no, it's not. I mean, it's really about communities, both rural and urban. The urban ag movement is really a manifestation of food sovereignty. And so it's important. So how did you come to be connected to food sovereignty?
I mean, the truth is, in 2007, I was actually dealing with a lot of health issues, and I had just moved out to the Bay in about 2005, and it became very clear to me how much food was medicine. And lucky for me, I had lots of friends that were working in really the urban food movement, and as I was interacting with them and nourishing my health and my body, I was starting to recognize some of the dynamics that were at play between them and their different institutions, and they were competing. And these were frontline organizations that were competing when it was so clear to everybody that they should have been collaborating, and they were competing because of the way that wealth was being distributed. And so I remember as Fierce Allies was sort of coming through, and people kept asking me, so who's the ideal audience for this? I kept saying, at that time, the food justice movement. And I was saying that to a bunch of my friends, and finally one of them was like, okay, could you just stop doing that, and could you actually just come work with us and help us figure it out? Because that was exactly, they were feeling that. They're like, we're fighting over this limited commodity of, money and power, which really aren't limited. There's plenty of it out there, but for some reason there's only a limited amount of it coming to us. And what if we could start figuring out how to be a we in this work, rather than fighting against each other, being played against each other, that we need to actually link up our different organizations, and we're addressing different aspects of the work, and then be informing funders on how to do a less shitty best in the distribution of resources.
Mm-hmm. Very good. So actually that brings us to the beginning to describe some of the episodes or experiences you've had where you've applied Fierce Allies, and the stories that have emerged, the things that you've seen happen. I mean, we were in relationship through this. This is how we met, working between the organization that I lead, Roots of Change, and a group in the East Bay that was working really on the front line around urban agriculture and food access, food justice. And so, why don't you describe some of the things that you've seen emerge, or the things that have inspired you or challenged you or led to evolution in your thinking?
I mean, you've heard me say this before, Michael, but you've been an instrumental partner for me in the development of this work. And when I was working with you in that organization, and we hit a lot of bumps. I mean, bumps is an understatement. And the theme, as I kept saying to you, and you kept rising to the occasion of, was I need to figure out how to work with white men like you. So if you'll stay here and we can keep doing a shitty best until we figure out what a decent best is, I'm in if you're in. And you kept being in. And that was, I don't feel like with Fierce Allies, I know what to tell people what to do, right? I'm doing facilitative leadership. And I knew, because of the work that I had done in prisons, a big component of this work is transforming shame, right? And so I like to think of shame is we're designed to experience shame. Shame is our kind of internal GPS on how to be in right relationship to community. And when we do a shitty best, shame goes rampant. And so when I was working in prisons, I was kind of doing R&D on, can shame be transformed? And with doing restorative justice work in those audiences, I found that it could be. So I was like, okay, if they can do it. And when I was working with adult populations in particular, lifers who had participated in pretty violent, horrendous crimes, I'm like, if they can do it, then I bet white people can probably transform shame. And so that was a big part of the work that you and I were working on. And, I'm curious to know where you want to go with the stories, because we have plenty to share. So,
well, yeah, I think it's interesting to talk about shame, because I was thinking about it this morning before you arrived, that, on my mother's side, my father came from Mississippi. On my father's side, my family was up in Northern California. In far Northern California, there was a lot of horrible things done to Native Americans. My family history doesn't go beyond my grandfather. I don't know what happened. My grandfather on my mother's side was from Mississippi. His family, going back to the Civil War, had been slaveholders. So in addition to the direct possibilities of my line being involved in things that caused me to feel shame and sadness, kind of guilt. I remember when I was a kid, the first book that I really my mother gave me for Christmas was a book about Native Americans, and I read that book. I must have been 12, 13. It totally hit me. I was kind of devastated by it. I remember being really upset and going and saying, we did this as a nation to the Native Americans? I was a kid, I didn't know. But I have to say that was kind of an indicator. I didn't know it at the time, but when I look back on my life, it was an indicator that there was something in me. It was a seed. It was like alive, and it was triggered by this. So I didn't do anything really with it for years. I obviously was a progressive person who thought about these things, but I wasn't active in it, and I really avoided it because it was very painful. At a certain level, it was painful. I thought about my grandfather. I saw his prejudice. I saw both my grandfather's prejudice. So I carried that in me, and it didn't really emerge. I couldn't name it until we started working together.
So do you remember what I said to you about shame when we were working together?
Remind me.
So, and this came to me as we were in the moment of that. But what I was moved to share with you was, as a white man, if you have come to this work to make your shame go away, you are delusional, and you're a liability to yourself and everybody in the room. And what I meant by that is, and I think I probably said this to you.
Yes.
Before you took your first breath as a white baby in America, the shame you inherited just based on the demographic of who you are and the lineage that brought you here, the shame that you inherited is overwhelming. Overwhelming. Like, I often think about this and, maybe joke about this with other people of color, but like, I would hate to have that be my inheritance. And it's not surprising to me that so many white men don't participate in these kinds of dialogues because it's so overwhelming. That's a very smart survival strategy. And I can actually respect that as a survival strategy, despite the fact that it doesn't produce the changes that they want, but I get it.
Yeah, so I want to dig deep. I just want to remind people what you said about the GPS, because the reason this is important is that we do, I believe, and you're saying it, and there's mountains of evidence, really, particularly if you're working with incarcerated people, to realize that there's something in us that does know what it should and should not be doing, or what is good for enhancing life and what is not good for enhancing life. And there is a tone that comes with that and a price to be paid when that GPS realizes that you're not in sync with life, let's say. And so what you're saying, and I will attest to it, is that you, when you're born into the white dominant culture, which has done a lot of bad things to folks here, Europeans, we know through oppression of peoples all around the world, we know it, slavery, genocide. So I would attest that I believe that we carry that, particularly white males, because there's also gender oppression.
Absolutely. And then to take that a step further, so again, overwhelming first breath you take, I'm on the planet, oh my God, overwhelmed, right? And then no matter how much good or bad work you do in the course of your lifetime, even if it was all good work, when you take that last breath, chances are, it's pretty much guaranteed, the shame that you will be passing on to white men in America will still be overwhelming because it's not going to change that dramatically in one lifetime. So if those are the bookends of your life, right, then it's not surprising, again, that so many white men with privilege disassociate from these kinds of conversations. But if you actually really want to make a difference, then your responsibility in this work is to not make your shame go away because it's not going anywhere, but how do you figure out how to embody your shame as a gift, as a tool? I remember with you, we talked about it as a buddy, but actually really trusting this is showing up because my body wants me to be in right relationship with all of my relations, which includes my ecosystem. And to just say a little bit about that, and I refer to this as sort of somatic intelligence. As a species, right, the reptilian part of our brain is the older part of our brain. It's the thing that we have in common with so many animals. It's the part of the brain that actually knows how to live in right relationship with our ecosystem. Then we evolved this frontal lobe that's supposed to make us smarter. I have my doubts about whether that's actually true. I think it's still an experiment that we're waiting to see the results of. But I have a lot more confidence in the back part of our brain, right? That reptilian brain. And that's where shame comes from. That, I'm about to destroy what it is that I need to survive. And we're a pack animal. So then just talking about our species' relationship to our species, we can't survive on our own. We have to survive in a community. And so we have this internal GPS that wants us to be in right relationship, knows how we are supposed to be in right relationship, and yet in our society, we shame our shame.
Mm-hmm. So this is really important because one of the things that's always struck me is that we've had, since the food movement goes back to the 30s and 40s when organic farming was first discussed in England. And we've had the environmental movement since the late 60s, or late 50s, early 60s. And yet the world is more polluted, and agriculture has created more destruction, and we have more bad things happening on the planet. And the reason I think that we haven't made much progress is because one of the things that we have not done is gone into what you're discussing, because what it does when you do, what I've seen in colleagues and in myself is that it forces you to drop down and listen. And frankly, it kind of humbles you. I mean, it humbles you to a place where what I've noticed is that folks of color and women trust me more now because they actually see, okay, so that guy is actually slowing down, not telling me what to do. He actually seems interested. Yeah. I mean, it's that simple, but it's that needed.
That's so core. I mean, cultural humility, right, is what's needed to build the kind of relationships that we have. So it's not that my way or my culture is right, but my culture is a way. And the only way that it's actually effective is if it's also honoring and effective in relationship to your culture. So we have to be able to navigate things that are unfamiliar, which are often uncomfortable. We have to be able to navigate unfamiliar and uncomfortable things skillfully. And so, again, going back to the practice of change with fierce allies, so basically what we do in this work is we create situations that are uncomfortable. Why? So that we can practice being uncomfortable, thereby increasing our capacity to be with discomfort, which then increases our capacity to be with what's unfamiliar, which is what allows us to create win-wins as opposed to either ors. And that goes back to that dichotomous piece that we were talking about earlier.
Okay, so this is good too, because I want to see if we can paint a little picture for people about what actually happens in, let's say, a retreat or a one-day event with you where you work with people, because I think it's about creating a safe space. And so could you just describe a little bit about how you create that space to allow us, the participants in these activities, to risk
Yeah.
and to settle in to something deeper and scary at some level?
I mean, I think there's a lot of pieces to it. One thing that may seem small, but to me feels really significant is a lot of times in trainings and those kinds of facilitated dialogues, there are ground rules. And we do what we refer to as practice agreements. And it feels like, again, subtle, but an important distinction. Why do we practice things, Michael?
To get better.
To get better, right? So if we're agreeing to practice things, and the assumption is we may not be very good at these. The assumption is also we are not likely to have mastery over this in the course of this dialogue or possibly even in our lifetime. But if we can all agree, humble ourselves, like, oh, I might be good at this sometimes in some circumstances, but recognize that we are practicing. And that's our common commitment here is we are practicing. We don't even call our work a theory of change. It's a practice of change. All we're doing is practicing so that we can increase our capacity, right, to be in the uncomfortable conversations, to be in the unfamiliar circumstances. So we start out by setting up practice agreements. We also then move into really restorative justice circle and checking in with a game we call If You Really Knew Me. And we actually do that after we have a pretty powerful conversation about shame. And it's worth saying we also talk about rage in a very similar way that we
Yes.
talk about shame. And so using the example of, let's say, a low-income trans person of color, I will say to them, if you've come to this work to make your rage go away, you are delusional. And you are a liability to yourself and everybody in the room, because in the same way that we're designed to experience shame, we're designed to experience rage. And rage is actually our reptilian brain's ability to protect what we love. So we get full of energy when something we love is in jeopardy of physical harm, but also emotional, psychological, psychospiritual harm as well. And the problem in our society is we also shame our rage. But what if we could actually practice rage to the point where we could be skillfully rageful, i.e., skillfully protecting what we love? And so again, that's what this container is about. So I start by normalizing shame and rage, right? And having that conversation, which I think both disorients people a little bit in a good way, but also starts to level the playing field. Like, oh, we can play with these very strong emotions that feel really risky. But I want to, it makes sense to people when they hear me talk about shame and rage in this way. And so then we do this conversation, if you really knew me. If you really knew me, I feel shame when X, Y, and Z. And so someone would say, I feel shame when I try to make a difference and I end up causing harm. And so we're standing in a circle, somebody will say theirs and they will step into the middle. And anybody who relates to that shame will step in as well. And then I invite people to take a breath. Just notice what it feels like to like step into, I feel that shame too. Look around, notice how many people are in the circle with you, and then step out. And similarly, I feel rage when I erect a boundary and someone disrespects it and they step in. And anyone who feels that similarly steps in as well. And one of the things that's most interesting is, first of all, it normalizes shame and rage, right? And the divides of race or class, those start to dissipate because we all feel shame when that shame thing happens, and we all feel rage when that rage thing happens. So all of a sudden, the normal dichotomies that divide us start to dissipate. So we're doing activities like that start to, what I refer to as, disorient us, so that we can reorient towards a new set of values, which are really around creating environments where we don't have those throwaways, and so that everybody is here, and we need to practice with everybody, and everybody's perspective matters. And then we continue to have dialogues where, again, I'm asking questions, but y'all are talking to each other, and you're learning about each other, and at the same time you're learning about yourself.
Thanks for listening to the first of 2 parts in this interesting conversation with Miakoda about crossing the boundaries of race and privilege. You have been listening to Flipping the Table, a podcast about food, farming, and the future. Flipping the Table is hosted by me, Michael Reed-Dimmock, and produced by Patrick Sexton. Our production colleague is Doris Meyer. Our sponsors include Roots of Change and the Public Health Institute. If you have questions, comments, suggestions, or would like to sponsor Flipping the Table, please email us at comments@flippingthetable.org. That's comments@flippingthetable.org. Thank you.